Rodzina by Karen Cushman. Chapter 8. Wyoming Territory. We sat in the waiting room at the depot, kicking our feet against our suitcases while Miss Doctor and Mr. Sprott sent and received telegrams. Once in a while I scratched my knees. Nobody said anything. The unclaimed orphans Sammy, Joe Lacey, and I were being sent back to Chicago, to a workhouse where we would work for our keep. Mr. Sprott was grumbling about having to take us all the way back to Chicago. Sammy, Joe, and Lacey weren't too happy about it either. Me, I didn't think a workhouse sounded very good, but no worse than being sold to some farmer or married to Mr. Clench. I was feeling awfully low. Was there no place for me, safe and a bit cheery, with a family who wanted a daughter and had plenty to eat? I wondered how the rest of us were, those orphans who had been taken by families. Were they merely servants washing dirty laundry and digging in the fields? Or were some of them happy with their new families? Did they have soft beds and porch swings and kisses good night? I hoped Nellie did, and Chester, Spud, and Mickey Dooley. I missed Mickey Dooley. I could have used a joke right about then. We sat kicking our suitcases until Miss Doctor and the Sprott came over, leading a big fellow white as a door in overalls and leather boots, the color of dried blood. "This gentleman," said Mr. Sprott, "has agreed to take our Sammy and give him a good home. Come forward, fortunate boy." Sammy jumped up and tried to run, but the fellow grabbed him and smacked him on the head. Sammy skidded across the floor right into the wood stove. We all jumped to our feet, but no one said a word. There was an awful silence, like the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Sprott chewed on his cigar a time or two, and then hauled off and punched the man so hard in the nose I thought his overalls would fly off. The big man hit the ground. "These kids is in my charge," Sprott said. "I smack 'em when they need smacking." And then he grabbed the leather boots and dragged the man outside without disturbing his cigar one whit. He dusted off his hands, pointed to us, and said, "Sit." You can bet we sat. Sprott and Miss Doctor went back into the telegraph office, where they shouted at each other, waving their arms around furiously as if shooing invisible pigeons away, and finally we saw him tip his hat to her and leave the depot. We waited a long time. I got tired of kicking my suitcase and got up to read the notices posted on the walls. J. White and Company, 27 Prairie Street. Photographs 25 cents. New methods, no holding long poses. This establishment has the best arranged light in the territory. Up one flight of stairs only. Know thyself. Heathcliff M. Pittleman, professor of phrenology, will examine the 37 organs of your brain and indicate your character and talent. Receive a written record of your exam. The latest and most successful remedy for consumption, coughs, and colds, Wilbur's compound of cod liver oil and lime. The Western Palace Theater, 8 p.m. this evening, the Irving Briggs Company of Thespians will perform a new play in 2 acts, Maid or Wife, or The Deceiver Deceived. The principal characters will be played by Mr. Briggs, Mr. Loblolly, Miss Hartley, Miss Copeland. Overture composed and conducted by Mr. Briggs. The morning was nearly gone when Miss Doctor came back. "I telegraphed a friend of mine from Chicago who now lives in Ogden, Utah Territory," she said, "where she and her husband run a hotel, and I have received her answer. She thinks some folks there would be willing to take in orphans, so you will not be going back to Chicago. We will go on to Utah." Sam and Joey and Lacey gave a big cheer, but I was too worried about who would want me and for what. "You must behave yourselves and be agreeable and not trouble me. Do you understand?" We all nodded. "Can we say goodbye to Mr. Sprott?" I asked her. I never liked the old sour-face much, and he sure didn't seem to like me, but he had been with us since Chicago, and he had stood up for Sammy when it counted. I thought he deserved at least a goodbye, but Miss Doctor said he was already on his way back to Chicago for another bunch of orphans. "Here," she said, handing us some bread and apples. "Go and eat while we wait for the train." Although it was bitter cold outside, the sun was shining. I could see what looked like storm clouds in the distance. "Is there a thunderstorm out there?" I asked a man loitering on the platform. He looked to where I pointed. "Why, missy, those are mountains, the Rocky Mountains." I couldn't imagine hills stretching so far into the sky, farther even than the grain elevators on Chicago's River Street, but it didn't surprise me. I had seen so many strange things on this trip across this big country that very little would surprise me anymore. "Those clouds are the Rocky Mountains," I told Sammy and Joe and Lacey when I joined them. Sammy had taken off his cap. He wiped his head with his handkerchief and spread the handkerchief on his lap and put his bread and apple there. "Watch out!" shouted Joe, but too late. A rat, near the size of an alley cat, ran up and grabbed Sammy's cap. Well, Sammy took off after him, while we all laughed like to fall right off the platform. The rat ran north and south, and Sammy ran north and south, and the rat ran back and forth, and Sammy ran back and forth. And finally the rat dropped the cap off the end of the platform into the dirty snow. While Sammy climbed down to get it, the rat doubled back, picked the hunk of bread off Sammy's handkerchief, and ran the other way. Why, that rat knew just what he wanted and figured out how to get it. I found myself admiring him, and things got to be real bad for a body to admire a rat. Finally we stopped laughing, and Sammy stopped fuming and sputtering. Lacey shared her bread with him, and we all ate. "That rat sure outsmarted dumb old Sammy," Joe said, "but I won't tell no one. It'll be my secret." Sammy frowned at him. "You ain't one that ought to make jokes about secrets." Joe jumped up, his hands balled into fists. "I think animals are smarter than people sometimes," I said, anxious to avoid another fight. "Papa told me about a mule at the stockyards. That mule knew exactly how many wagon loads he should pull from the killing shed to the yard in one day, and when that number was pulled, be it noon or 9, he would pull no more, and never would he pull a load on Sunday." Sammy nodded. "Lions in Africa attack only men, never women and children." "That ain't so," said Joe. "It is." "How do you know?" "I know. That's all." "Birds who live on the side of a hill lay square eggs so they don't roll away," I said. "That sounds like hogwash to me," said Sammy. I looked up from my apple and saw on the far end of the platform my first Indians. Such a sight to remember and to tell to. Well, I had no one to tell, but it was a sight anyway. Real Indians in faded pants and blankets, calico skirts, some with beads and feathers in their hair. For sure I wasn't in Chicago anymore. Slowly the station grew crowded. High-booted, shaggy-haired men in overcoats made of woolen blankets or wagon rugs, wrapped around with ammunition belts, washed themselves under the pump. Faded, worn, anxious women bounced chubby children in their arms. There were men in spectacles and women with lunch baskets and pretty girls and wailing babies. "Look at all them guns," said Joe. He was right. Seemed like everyone but the babies had guns. "That's because of Big-Nosed George," Sammy said. "Who's he?" Lacey said. "You don't know about Big-Nosed George? Why, he's the most fearsome train bandit riding the rails today. Robbed some 400 trains and got away each time. Killed 3 men in Texas for looking at his nose. And threw an old lady off a train in—" Lacey started to cry. "Oh, rubbish," I said. "It's only a story of Sammy's. If Big-Nosed George were real, I would have seen a wanted poster for him, familiar as I am with the notices hung in train stations, and I have not." Lacey looked up at me and smiled. Her tears flashed on her face like diamonds. What a face she had! No one would ever call her Big-Nosed Lacey, or Potato Nose, or some other ugly name. I put my hand over my own nose and walked to the edge of the platform and stared at the empty tracks pointing west toward the mountains. Behind me I could hear the moaning of the train whistle. I turned toward the sound. A little black dot grew bigger and bigger as the clanging and tooting got louder and louder until, with a burst of sound and steam like a hot Chicago summer, the train pulled in.